The greatest hidden war of the 20th century wasn't fought with bullets, but with the very earth under our feet. A battle where one superpower learned to heal its wounds while the other systematically raped its own land to fuel a failing machine. In the United States, the 1970s marked a historic turning point, the birth of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and a national realization that the air we breathe and the water we drink are finite treasures. American citizens, empowered by a free press, forced their government to clean up the Great Lakes, ban toxic pesticides, and create a system where industrial giants were held legally and financially accountable for their filth. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was operating under a philosophy of total ecocide, where nature was viewed as an obstacle to be conquered, and every river, forest, and sea was merely a resource to be sacrificed for the next production quota. The Soviet state didn't just pollute, it erased entire ecosystems, operating in total secrecy and treating every industrial disaster as a state secret that was more important than the lives of the people living in the fallout zones. This fundamental contrast, the American model of transparency and restoration versus the Soviet model of production at any cost, is the reason why the U.S. remains a land of pristine national parks today, while the former Soviet Union is a graveyard of radioactive ghost towns and toxic dust bowls. The contrast in industrial responsibility and the Cuyahoga moment proved that a free society can correct its mistakes before it's too late. In the late 1960s, when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio literally caught fire due to industrial pollution, the images shocked the American conscience, leading to the Clean Water Act and a massive, transparent effort to save the nation's waterways. The American system turned a disaster into a catalyst for progress, forcing factories to install filters and treating the environment as a shared public asset. In the USSR, rivers didn't catch fire. They simply turned into liquid poison. The industrial heartlands of the Urals and Siberia became zones of ecological disaster, where the air was so thick with lead and sulfur that children were born with chronic respiratory failures. Yet because the state owned the factories and controlled the media, there was no protest, no Clean Air Act, and no accountability. The Soviet manager was rewarded for meeting the plan, even if it meant dumping tons of toxic waste directly into the drinking water of millions, an institutionalized blindness that turned the motherland into a sacrificial lamb for a state that valued steel output more than the lungs of its citizens. The role of national parks and the spirit of preservation showed two different ways of valuing the beauty of the planet. In the U.S., the National Park Service was a sacred institution, protecting millions of acres of wilderness for the enjoyment of all people, a concept that the land belongs to the citizens, not the government. American conservation was rooted in the idea that nature has a soul and a value beyond its timber or minerals, creating a legacy of stewardship that became a core part of the American identity. In the USSR, nature reserves, zapovedniki, were often just playgrounds for the elite, or, worse, land that was saved only until the party decided it needed more coal or more wheat. The Soviet state viewed the wilderness with a cold, utilitarian eye. If a forest stood in the way of a new canal, the forest was leveled. If a mountain contained ore, the mountain was hollowed out. This violent reshaping of the landscape was seen as a triumph of socialist progress, ignoring the reality that they were destroying the very biological foundation of their future, leaving the next generation with a land that was scarred, barren, and increasingly uninhabitable. The contrast in nuclear waste and the secret disasters before Chernobyl revealed the lethal arrogance of the Soviet atomic program in the U.S., while the nuclear industry faced intense public scrutiny and protests that led to strict safety regulations and transparent waste management protocols. The Soviet Union was conducting a secret war against its own soil, the most horrific example being the 1957 Kyshtym disaster at the Mayak nuclear plant, where an explosion released massive amounts of radiation. Instead of evacuating the area and warning the world, The Soviet states simply erased the affected villages from the map, changed their names, and left thousands of people to live on radioactive land without ever knowing why they were dying. This culture of the lie ensured that the Soviet nuclear program remained the most dangerous in the world, operating with zero public oversight and a total disregard for the half-life of its mistakes. A difference that meant an American nuclear accident was a national scandal, while a Soviet nuclear accident was a state secret buried in a nameless grave. The final contrast in this first part is the vanishing of the Aral Sea versus the Great Lakes restoration, which stands as the most visible crime of the Soviet era. In the U.S., the joint effort between the U.S. and Canada to clean the Great Lakes showed that international cooperation and scientific management could reverse decades of industrial damage, restoring life to one of the world's largest freshwater systems. In the USSR, the Aral Sea was murdered by the state, a massive inland sea that was drained to irrigate cotton fields in the desert. A project of such monumental stupidity and ecological blindness that it caused the sea to shrink by 90% in just a few decades, leaving behind a toxic salt desert that poisoned the climate and the people for 1,000 miles around. This wasn't an accident. It was a planned disaster, proof that when a state has total power over the environment and zero accountability to its people, it will eventually destroy the very earth it claims to lead. A catastrophe that remains a haunting warning to the world that you cannot plan nature without destroying yourself in the process. The concept of the secret city and the geography of exclusion created a dual reality that the Western world could barely conceive of. In the United States, industrial and military zones were clearly marked and subject to federal laws, and while the Manhattan Project had its secrets, the long-term impact on the surrounding communities became a matter of public record and intense legal debate, ensuring that the government couldn't simply forget about the people living near a toxic site. In the USSR, the state created a shadow empire of closed cities known only by postal codes like Chelyabinsk 65 or Arzamas 16. These were places that officially did not exist on any map, where hundreds of thousands of people lived in a bubble of relative comfort while working in high-risk chemical and nuclear facilities. These cities were the ultimate expression of Soviet compartmentalization, where the state traded sausage and security for the silence of the workers. While just outside the barbed wire, the surrounding environment was being turned into a radioactive wasteland. This was a system designed to contain not just radiation, but information, ensuring that when a leak or an explosion occurred, the truth was trapped behind the same fences as the people, a difference that allowed the U.S. to debate its environmental future while the Soviet citizen lived in a curated illusion, unaware that the soil beneath their feet was a ticking time bomb. The contrast in chemical warfare testing and Island 7 reveals the most terrifying depths of Soviet ecological negligence. In the U.S., the testing of biological and chemical agents, while controversial and often hidden in the past, eventually faced the light of the Church Committee and strict international treaties that led to the dismantling of stockpiles and the decontamination of sites like Rocky Mountain Arsenal. The American system was forced by its own laws to stop poisoning its backyard. In the USSR, the Vozrozdeniya Island in the Aral Sea became a nightmare of biological experimentation, a place where anthrax, plague, and smallpox were tested in the open air. When the Aral Sea began to dry up due to the state's irrigation projects, this island of death became a peninsula, creating a land bridge for ancient, weaponized pathogens to migrate toward populated areas. The Soviet state had created a biological minefield and then literally paved a road for the disease to reach its own citizens, a level of strategic incompetence and environmental recklessness that proved the party viewed the entire USSR as a laboratory where the rats were its own people. The role of socialist transformation of nature versus ecological balance was a clash between 19th century industrial arrogance and 20th century scientific wisdom. the Soviet ideology was obsessed with the Stalinist plan for the transformation of nature, which involved reversing the flow of massive rivers, planting shelter belts in deserts where they couldn't survive, and building gargantuan dams that destroyed the spawning grounds of the world's most valuable fish. This was ideology masquerading as science, a belief that the communist will could rewrite the laws of thermodynamics and biology in the US. While early industrialization was also destructive, the rise of ecology as a respected science in the 1960s led to a shift toward environmental management and restoration, acknowledging that a healthy economy requires a functioning biosphere. The American system learned to work with nature. The Soviet system tried to break nature's neck, and in the process, it broke the back of its own economy as the massive transformation projects resulted in salinized soil, dried-up fisheries, and a climate that became increasingly hostile to the very agriculture the state was trying to save. The contrast in waste management and the trash crisis showed the difference between a society that produces too much and a society that can't handle what it has. In the US, the Keep America Beautiful campaign and the development of sanitary landfills and recycling programs in the 1970s represented a massive effort to manage the waste of a consumer society. While still a challenge, it was a visible, regulated process that the public could influence through local government. In the USSR, waste didn't exist in the propaganda, but it choked the reality because the state didn't recognize waste as a category of the planned economy. Thousands of unofficial, unregulated, wild dumps appeared on the edges of every city, where industrial chemicals, medical waste, and household trash were piled in mountains with zero liners or protection for the groundwater. The Soviet citizen lived in a permanent state of filth, where the beauty of the socialist city ended at the first alleyway. A difference that turned the Soviet suburbs into toxic borderlands where the smell of burning plastic and rotting refuse was the permanent scent of the bright future. The final contrast in this part is the citizen activism versus the silence of the grave, which was the only thing that could have saved the Soviet environment but was the one thing the state feared most. In the US, the first Earth Day in 1970 saw 20 million people take to the streets, a massive display of democratic pressure that forced both Republicans and Democrats to pass the most stringent environmental laws in history. The American citizen was the watchdog that kept the air clean. In the USSR, to be an environmentalist was to be a traitor. Any group that tried to protect a local forest or clean a local lake was viewed by the KGB as a political cell and suppressed. It wasn't until the very end, during Glasnost, that the Green Movement exploded as the first form of legal political opposition. But by then, the damage was so total that it was no longer a matter of conservation, but of national survival. The American system used the voice of the people to save the land. The Soviet system used the silence of the people to bury the land, a difference that ensured when the USSR finally collapsed, it left behind an inheritance of poison that will take centuries to heal. The madness of nuclear explosions for the national economy stands as the ultimate testament to the Soviet state's arrogance, a program so reckless it borders on science fiction. In the United States, Project Plowshare experimented with the idea of using nuclear devices for excavation, but it was quickly shut down in the 1970s after the government and the public realized the catastrophic risks of long-term radiation and the impossibility of containing the fallout. The American system possessed a rational stop button, triggered by scientific consensus and public fear. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union conducted over 120 peaceful nuclear explosions, PNEs, well into the late 1980s, using atomic bombs to create underground gas storage, to deep probe the Earth's crust, and even to move mountains for canal construction. This was atomic vandalism on a continental scale, where the state treated radioactive fallout as a minor inconvenience in the path of socialist construction. Leaving behind dozens of atomic lakes and contaminated zones that are still leaking radiation into the water table today, The American scientist feared the atom. The Soviet bureaucrat worshipped the atom as a shovel, a difference in sanity that turned vast tracts of Siberia and Kazakhstan into permanent radioactive no-go zones for the sake of industrial shortcuts. The contrast in river diversion schemes and the battle for the Arctic revealed a Soviet plan that could have altered the rotation of the Earth itself. In the US, the era of massive, destructive dam building peaked early and then faced intense ecological pushback, leading to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which protected the last untamed waters from being choked by concrete. The American system learned to respect the natural flow of life. In the USSR, the state spent decades planning the Aral project, a plan to reverse the flow of the great Siberian rivers, like the Ob and the Irtysh, to send them south to the shrinking Aral Sea. This was a project of such staggering environmental hubris that scientists warned it could change the salinity of the Arctic Ocean, melt the polar ice caps, and shift the global climate. While the American public was fighting to save a single valley, the Soviet project of the century threatened to sabotage the planet's thermostat. And it was only the total economic collapse of the USSR that stopped this ecological apocalypse from becoming a reality. A narrow escape that proves the Soviet Union was a suicide machine that was willing to kill the globe to fix its own local failures. The role of industrial cannibalism in the Norilsk and Magnitogorsk regions created cities that were literally breathing death. In the US, the Rust Belt faced painful but necessary transitions where the EPA forced dying industries to either clean up or shut down, leading to the rebirth of cities like Pittsburgh, which transformed from a smoke-choked furnace into a clean center of technology and medicine. The American system allowed for economic evolution. In the USSR, the state practiced industrial cannibalism, where it kept ancient poisonous factories running for 70 years without a single filter or upgrade, because the plan demanded quantity over life. Cities like Norilsk became the most polluted places on Earth, where the snow turned black, the trees for 100 miles died from acid rain, and the average life expectancy was 10 years lower than the national average. The Soviet state didn't see a city. It saw a labor camp with a smokestack, a difference that turned the industrial heart of the USSR into a landscape of terminal illness, where the very air was a commodity stolen from the lungs of the workers to feed the furnaces of a dying empire. The contrast in wildlife conservation and the black market showed the failure of the state to protect even its most iconic symbols. In the US, the 1970s saw the spectacular recovery of the bald eagle and the implementation of the Endangered Species Act, which prioritized the survival of a species over the profits of a corporation, creating a culture where protection had teeth and funding. In the USSR, while they had beautiful laws on paper, the state's desperation for hard currency led to the systematic poaching of its own treasures. From the massive, legalized slaughter of whales in the Southern Ocean, violating every international treaty, to the export of rare animal parts for foreign credits, the Soviet Union operated like a global ecological pirate, pretending to be a protector of nature while its state agencies were secretly harvesting the last of the Siberian tigers and sturgeons to fill the gaps in its failing treasury. The American system viewed wildlife as a national heritage. The Soviet system viewed wildlife as a liquid asset for the KGB's secret accounts, a hypocrisy that brought some of the world's most unique species to the very brink of extinction. The final contrast in this part is the legacy of the abandoned military and the toxic tundra, which remains a ticking time bomb for the modern world. In the US, the closure of a military base involves a multi-billion-dollar Superfund cleanup process to ensure the land is safe for civilian use, a legal requirement that holds the Pentagon accountable to the public. In the USSR, when the military left a site, they simply dropped everything where it stood, leaving behind thousands of rusted barrels of chemical waste, abandoned nuclear reactors in the Arctic seas, and unexploded munitions scattered across the wilderness. The Soviet military was a source of permanent pollution, treating the vastness of Russia as a bottomless trash can where they could dump their radioactive fuel and toxic fuel oxidizers without ever looking back. This scorched earth policy has left the post-Soviet world with a cleanup bill that no one can pay. A difference that proves the Soviet state didn't love its land. It occupied its land, and like any occupying army, it left only ruins and poison behind when it finally retreated into history. The ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union was not just a political event. It was a biological and environmental surrender, where the state finally realized that you cannot build a bright future on a foundation of poisoned earth and radioactive ruins. In the United States, the 1980s proved that capitalism and environmentalism could coexist through the Superfund law, which forced corporations to pay billions for the cleanup of toxic sites, creating a system of perpetual accountability that made the environment a central pillar of national security. The American system learned to value the unseen benefits of a clean ecosystem, recognizing that a healthy population is the ultimate source of wealth. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet state was drowning in its own filth as the massive industrial complexes that were supposed to be the pride of socialism became toxic anchors dragging the empire into the abyss. The state had spent 70 years treating the environment as a bottomless sink for its incompetence. And by the end, the cost of the cleanup, from the Aral Sea to Chernobyl, was larger than the entire Soviet GDP. This wasn't just a failure of planning. It was a failure of the soul, a realization that the Soviet Union had destroyed the very motherland it claimed to protect, proving that a system that does not respect the laws of nature will eventually be erased by them. The contrast in transparency as a life-saving tool remains the most chilling lesson of the late 20th century in the U.S. The 1984 Bhopal disaster in India, involving an American company, led to a massive wave of right-to-know laws, ensuring that every American citizen has access to information about the chemicals stored in their neighborhood. The American model used fear and sunlight as disinfectants, forcing industry to be honest, because the alternative was a legal and public relations catastrophe. In the USSR, the state's first and only instinct was secrecy. Until the very end, even after the 1986 Chernobyl explosion, the state allowed children in Kiev to march in May Day parades while radioactive dust was falling on their heads, all to prevent panic and preserve the image of the party. This lethal prioritization of the image over the individual was the final nail in the coffin of Soviet legitimacy. As the people realized that their own government was a greater threat to their lives than any foreign invader. A difference in honesty that proved that a free press is not just a political luxury, but an essential biological defense mechanism for a modern nation. The role of environmental refugees in the geography of despair highlighted the human cost of the Soviet ecocide in the U.S. While there were incidents like Love Canal, the legal system provided a mechanism for evacuation, compensation, and the relocation of victims, ensuring that no American citizen was forced to live in a death zone without recourse. The American system at least attempted to repair the human damage. In the USSR, millions of people were left to rot in zones of hard ecological control, where the water was yellow, the air was sulfurous, and the soil was mercury-laden. These people became forgotten citizens of a toxic empire, unable to leave because they had no propiska residence permit for other cities and no money to move. The state simply left them there to act as human filters for its industrial waste, a cruelty that created a class of broken, sick, and angry people who had nothing left to lose when the system finally began to shake. A difference in empathy that turned the Soviet heartland into a landscape of terminal sorrow. The contrast in sustainable development versus planetary plunder showed the difference between a future-oriented society and a suicide cult. In the U.S., the transition toward renewable energy, fuel efficiency standards, and sustainable forestry in the late Cold War era was a signal that the nation was preparing for a long-term relationship with the planet. The American system, driven by innovation and consumer demand, began to decouple economic growth from environmental destruction. In the USSR, the state remained trapped in a predatory cycle of extraction, believing that the only way to show growth was to dig more, burn more, and dump more. This dinosaur economy was incapable of adapting to the new world, and its collapse left the former Soviet republics with a legacy of rust and rot that has stunted their development for decades. The American system left a ladder to the future. The Soviet system left a poisoned well, a difference that proves that true power is measured not by how much you can take from the earth, but by how much you can leave behind for those who follow. The final verdict on the ecological Cold War is that the American model won because it allowed for dissent, correction, and the love of the land. It recognized that the environment is not a subset of the economy, but the economy is a subset of the environment. A realization that allowed the U.S. to emerge from the 20th century as a leader in both wealth and conservation. The Soviet experiment was a 70-year war against nature that nature eventually won, leaving behind a warning for all of human history. A state that treats its land as a conquered territory will eventually find itself ruling over a cemetery. The American citizen possessed a voice to save their world. The Soviet citizen was silenced until their world was gone. And the end of the Cold War was the moment the world looked at the black snow of Norilsk and the dry bed of the Aral Sea, and realized that the red star had become a black hole that had swallowed the future of an entire continent. A tragedy that proves that the greatest act of patriotism is not to serve the state, but to protect the earth that sustains us all. What do you think? Was the bigger danger to the Soviet citizen the lack of technology in the public hospital, or the existence of the secret Kremlin clinic for the elite? Share your thoughts below.